I have an academic history, which I suspect is probably similar to at least a lot of you out here on BookTube. And let me know in the comments if any of this sounds familiar. As a student, I loved history and literature. Those were my two favorite classes in high school because they were both narratives, and I loved narratives. I loved hearing stories. I loved reading stories. I loved somebody telling me stories. I just loved being involved in a story. And then I went on to university where I was a history major, a literature minor. And of course, you get to the end of university and there's always a question with, well, what do you do with a history degree? And I considered for several years going back to school and getting an advanced graduate degree in history, like a master's or a PhD, and going the whole academic route. And read some history books in my mid-20s while I was contemplating this, and discovered that I did not have an aptitude for reading academic texts. The more dense or the more academic a text got, the more I seemed to check out and lose interest. But I have maintained my interest in history as narrative all throughout my life and have been attracted to narrative histories. And by narrative histories, I mean books that tell history as a story. I think the common term for this is narrative history. So somebody let me know if there's another term I should be using. But what I mean by this is a history book, but one in which the author uses all the skills as a storyteller to tell you the history. And it's not concerned with analyzing or analytics or statistics or stuff like that. It's getting into the personalities, getting into the drama, just getting into all the joys of telling a good story. So I thought if this is what I love to read, then why not just kind of compile a list of my favorite narrative histories. Now, I guess the usual caveats, this is not the list of the best narrative histories, period. This is simply the narrative histories that I have read, and it reflects to a large extent my own narrow interests in history. It also probably reflects my limited reading. I wish I had read more books, but I'm a slow reader. I only read a handful of books per year, and only a few of those are nonfiction. But these are the best narrative histories that I've read, and I'd like to share them with you. You can take all of these as recommendations if you're another person who likes narrative history. And if you are somebody on BookTube who also loves reading narrative histories, I would love to hear your list. So, this is, I guess, maybe kind of like an unofficial tag. There aren't any questions other than just what are your best narrative histories. But if you wanted to make your own video on that, let me know. I'd love to hear your takes. I'm always looking for good recommendations on narrative histories. Now, a number of the ones on my list are biographies, and of course, right? Because there's a huge overlap between popular histories and biographies. A lot of popular histories come in the form of biographies, and a number of these biographies are really well written and good narrative histories. But I want to try and maybe separate out, first of all, the narrative histories which are not biographies, because to a certain extent, I think those can be more interesting because instead of the focus just being on one person, you've got a cast of characters and the storyteller, the author, is kind of setting them all out and helping you keep track of who is who and giving each character their own literary descriptions and backstory and helping you visualize the whole field of players, so to speak. So the narrative histories I really enjoyed, which are not biographies, Revolutions of 1848 by Priscilla Robertson. Now, there are a lot of books written on 1848, but most of them are not narratives. Most of them are trying to analyze what exactly happened in 1848 and why there were revolutions all over Europe in the same year, what were the conditions, etc. But Priscilla Robertson writes this as a narrative. So she doesn't cover everything, of course, but she covers some of the major cities in 1848 with each one. She kind of goes in, she introduces us to the main characters, she sets the tone, she builds a lot of suspense in the narrative. As I said in my review of that book, it is a little bit jarring to kind of have to switch cities every 50 pages or so to get to know a new cast of characters. So it's like a lot of mini narratives within one book, but it's quite well done for what it is. I should mention something I forgot to say at the top of this video. A number of these books I've already talked about before on this channel. For those cases, I'll link to my video in the description down below. And then for books that I haven't yet gotten around to talking on this channel, I'll just leave those ones out. Okay, moving on. Sideshow, Kissinger, Nixon, and the Destruction of Cambodia by William Shawcross. This is one I've already reviewed on this channel before. I'll link it in the description down below. As I said in that review, I was expecting a political polemic because this is a book that does seek to lay accusations at Kissinger and Nixon's administration. And it is a polemic, but somewhat to my surprise, it's a great narrative as well, because William Shawcross, using all his skills as a journalist, is able to pull all these different sources, recreate conversations, tell us about the personality conflicts, tell us all the stories of who was involved. I found it a fascinating narrative, as well as a political polemic. The Fall of Paris by Alistair Horn, another book I've talked about on this channel before, link in the description below. But this is about the Paris Commune. Now, I've read a lot of books on the Paris Commune, and I've talked about most of them on this channel. But this one was by far the best narrative. There are a lot of characters to keep track of in the Paris Commune and the preceding year, the year that preceded it. Alistair Horn does the best job of any author I've read so far of describing these characters as if they're characters in a story. So in almost any other book in the Paris Commune and the preceding Franco-Prussian War, the reader who's not intimately familiar with this period in French history just gets bombarded with all of these names at once. But Alistair Horn does a very good job of saying, okay, this is this person, this is his characteristics, this is what made him tick, and you of course remember that person then. And then even though there's a huge cast of characters, you're able to keep them all straight. And you really get sucked into both the story, but also the personal drama here. The Great Upheaval by Jay Winnick. I've reviewed this on this channel before. I had some criticisms of this book in terms of its focus. I thought it was somewhat focused on some of the wrong things. This is a book on the French Revolution and also how the French Revolution was affecting America and Russia. However, if you put aside questions of the focus of the book and just evaluate it on the author's ability to tell a good story, well, to create a good scene, there are some scenes in here which he recreates with just very compelling narrative. I mean, he's recreating historical scenes, but he's describing them like they're as part of a novel. So it can be very fascinating. The Judgment of Paris by Ross King. So this is a book on art history, which is something I'm not normally interested in. I'm not a big art guy. But he really draws out the personalities and the conflicts of all the characters that are involved in this period. And it makes for a great narrative history, whether you're interested in art or not. Okay, The Scramble for Africa by Thomas Pakenham. I think this is my favorite narrative history, full stop. Like I think this is the best one on the list, actually. And it's hiding under a somewhat unassuming title, right? The title of the book is The Scramble for Africa, 1876 to 1912. And you think, okay, well, that sounds like a boring academic read. But it is not. It is completely narrative driven. It is a lot of separate little episodes that all put together kind of give you somewhat of a sweep of the whole period with the Scramble for Africa. But it is told by focusing on all these stories that were happening during that time. And there are stories about diplomatic wrangling back in Europe and the political maneuvers that were going on. And there are stories about soldiers and explorers and missionaries in Africa, and you get their stories as well. So, check this one out. If you love narrative history, this is a great book. Overlapping somewhat with this is Three Empires on the Nile by Dominic Green, aka The Victorian Jihad, 1869 to 1899. Sorry, I shouldn't say aka. Subtitle is The Victorian Jihad. So this covers the same overlapping time period with the Scramble for Africa, but this kind of zeroes in more on just one specific region and a couple different countries, and tells it in a great narrative fashion. Maybe I might also sneak in here Monarchy by David Starkey. I don't really count this one because it does cover a huge time period. And I tend to think of narrative histories as telling like a focused story in detail. But David Starkey does write, and he writes as a storyteller, even though he's covering like 1,000 years of history here. The World That Never Was by Alex Butterworth, which is a story about radicalism at the end of the 19th century. It's made up of a lot of different elements, but they're all told in a narrative style. The book has some passages which are better than others, but at its strongest, I think Alex Butterworth is a very good storyteller. And there are some passages where he really does a lot of work to create a narrative and to create a scene, describing what the weather was like on that particular day, describing, trying to kind of immerse you into the setting for these stories. There are a couple books here on the fall of the Roman Empire, or the last 100 years of the Roman Empire. There's Rubicon by Tom Holland and The Storm Before the Storm by Mike Duncan. And both of these are great narrative histories. They're Rubicon especially is covering almost 100-year period. So we are kind of skipping quickly through a lot of stuff, and we don't get the time to focus in depth on some of these characters like we do in some of the other histories on this list. But Tom Holland writes in such a great narrative way. He's really bringing to life all these characters. Mike Duncan's book is focused on a little smaller slice of the same time period. I don't think Mike Duncan is quite the writer that Tom Holland is, although who is, huh? I mean, Tom Holland is a really great narrative writer. But they're both great narrative histories. A World on Fire by Amanda Foreman. So, A World on Fire, I used to see this in bookstores all the time. I don't see it quite as much now, so maybe this is a book whose time has come and gone. But this is a book about England's involvement in the American Civil War. And it's the type of subject where you would think it would be more heavy on analysis, but Amanda Foreman chooses to focus in on a number of personal characters, a number of individual people, and tell the story of England's involvement in the American Civil War by following the path of all these different characters. Some of them are just ordinary people who are, serving in the army or, coming in from England to volunteer. Some of them are politicians or government officials. It's almost a little bit overwhelming, the sheer cast of characters in this book. I did flip to the index a lot to keep track. But it is definitely, the whole thing is narrative driven and really fascinating to read, very engaging. Mayday 1971 by Lawrence Roberts. So this is more of a recent narrative history. The events of Mayday protest in 1971, but again told in great narrative way, and because it's more recent history, Lawrence Roberts is able to interview a lot of the people still living and draw on their recollections and recreate the scenes, and it's a great narrative history as well. Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. This, of course, was recently made into a movie, which is how I found out about it. And it's, I guess this gets categorized as forgotten history. This was a big deal at the time, as David Grann shows in his book, and was a media event at the time, but then subsequently just got completely forgotten about. I never heard about it till the movie came out. The movie is based on this book. But this was a big deal at the time, and David Grann has a reputation for being a good narrative history writer. So I regret that I've not read more of his stuff, although I hope to remedy that in the future. And this is just a great, it's a somber tale. It's a tragedy, but it's told with all the skills of a storyteller. Okay, so now let's get into the biographies here. Some great narrative biographies here. Conspirator, Linen in Exile by Helen Rappaport. Just very great writing. She creates very good scenes, creates tension. Fascinating book to read. A couple books on Lafayette. One is For Liberty and Glory, Washington, Lafayette, and the Revolutions by James R. Gaines. The other is Mike Duncan's book, Hero of Two Worlds, which both of which I've talked about on this channel. Mike Duncan's more recently. Washington and Lafayette had a fascinating relationship, and both books do a good job of telling the story of Washington and Lafayette and their relationship. And in the case of Mike Duncan's book, we get a broader view of Lafayette's whole life. Karl Marx, A Life by Francis Wheen. So I've tried to read a few books on Marx, and as somebody who's not so much interested in philosophy and doesn't really have an aptitude for philosophy, I'm more interested in the narrative details of Marx's life. And I think Francis Wheen does a very good job of catering to a reader like me who wants to know about the story of Marx's life and his family dramas and personal dramas, but doesn't want to get too heavy into the weeds of philosophy. This is a very good narrative on Marx's life. Young Stalin by Seamen Sebag Montefiore, which is a book I've just talked about on this channel very recently. And in my review, I did complain about it a little bit, about how I thought the endless repetition of kind of Stalin playing cat and mouse with the police as a young revolutionary got into a little bit more detail than I was personally on board for, as it turned out. But Simon Sebag Montefiore is a good writer. the narrative is well told, and there are scenes in here which are really great. The opening scene when he's describing the great Bolshevik bank robbery, it is masterful narrative history. Apologies, I'm a little bit tired and I'm having trouble getting my words straight. That happens to me sometimes, but bear with me. All right, Alexander the Great by Philip Friedman. This is a great biography of Alexander the Great. It is told in such a great narrative way. You really get sucked into the ancient world and Alexander's conquest as he's going to all these distant lands. And I felt when I was reading this book like I was constantly imagining all these places that Alexander was getting to explore. It just sucks you into the whole ancient world that Alexander the Great, with his armies, he covered a lot of that ancient world, and he covered what was for him the very edges of the known world, and you get sucked into that story here with Philip Friedman. So that was a really great book. The Life of Mahatma Gandhi by Louis Fisher is a great narrative of Gandhi's life. Again, told by somebody who was a journalist. So somebody who's very skilled at creating narratives. And yes, okay, I think that's the end of my list here. So those are my favorite narrative histories, and let me know what yours are. I'm always up for narrative history recommendations. And if any of you are interested in narrative histories, hopefully you've gotten some good recommendations off of this video. Thank you.